1934 was an interesting year. August witnessed the death of President von Hindenburg and Adolf Hitler's consolidation of the offices of Chancellor and President. He thus became the German Führer. In October, Mao Zedong began the long march from South China with 100,000 devoted companions, only 20,000 of whom would live to see Yan'an in the north the following year. 1934 found the United States in the depths of the Great Depression, but a ray of hope glimmered on the horizon. President Roosevelt's New Deal had begun to restore confidence in some employment. His approval of the National Industrial Recovery Act in June 1933 created the notion that perhaps the country had turned the corner, but only the foundation for recovery had been laid. Economic stagnation still stalked the land. Late summer of 1934 found Georgia in the midst of a hotly contested gubernatorial campaign. Governor Eugene Talmadge, the wild man from Sugar Creek, was seeking his second two-year term as the state's chief executive. He had previously served 3 terms as State Agriculture Commission and was extremely popular in the vast rural regions of Georgia. His opponent, Superior Court Judge Claude Pittman, was a political novice. In view of the staggering needs facing Georgia during these dark days of the Depression, Talmadge's simplistic 3-point platform was incredible. He favored the creation of the office of Lieutenant Governor, second, a 4-year term for governor, and lastly, payment of the state debt without paying taxes. Beyond this, Talmadge was really saying to the people that all they needed to solve their problems was Old Gene and FDR, that is. Throughout the campaign, Talmadge tried to associate himself with Roosevelt. His detractors were not convinced, and Pittman charged repeatedly that Talmadge was obstinately blocking the New Deal in Georgia. Organized labor supported Pittman during the campaign, charging that Talmadge had failed completely to grasp the fundamental principles of the Roosevelt Recovery Program. J. Sid Tiller, president of the Georgia Federation of Labor, issued a formal statement declaring that Talmadge and the State Highway Department are imposing conditions of virtual peonage upon the workers of Georgia. He called on fair-minded citizens to save labor from being forced to the verge of starvation wages. Tiller said, Governor Talmadge is not in sympathy with the New Deal. His is the reactionary viewpoint of the advocates of the Old Deal, which was based on long hours and low wages. Tiller pointed out that Talmadge had proved his opposition to the recovery program by his handling of federal funds sent to Georgia to relieve human suffering. Instead of attempting to relieve distress, Talmadge used these funds as a weapon to beat down wages and lengthen hours of labor. He and his agents acted so flagrantly in setting the wage scale at 5 cents an hour in the rural counties of Georgia that federal authorities removed control of these funds from Talmadge's office. The Central Labor Union of Augusta and the Columbus Central Labor Union both concurred unanimously with the action by the Georgia Federation of Labor. The Macon Federation of Trades issued a separate statement, condemning Talmadge's stand against the NRA as inexcusable and unpatriotic. The Macon Declaration held Talmadge's position a brazen one, which together with his approval of the deplorable highway wage scale stamped his personal approval upon chiseling contractors and other violators of NRA codes. Eugene Talmadge was indeed a genuine reactionary, a vicious racist with a bizarre, flamboyant personality. Talmadge was the quintessential Southern demagogue. His political strength lay primarily in the rural regions, which held inordinate voting strength due to Georgia's county unit system. This system gave each of Georgia's 159 counties 2 votes for each representative it had in the General Assembly. In this way, 3 tiny counties had the power to nullify the vote of giant Fulton County. The popular vote was effectively disfranchised. The candidate with the greatest following in the rural areas was a certain winner in any election. Talmadge knew that his electoral strength lay with his rural constituents, the wool hat boys, and he courted them assiduously. But Talmadge also received warm support from a large section of Georgia's urban business community. Atlanta bankers and corporation executives soon learned that he was safe. He favored a low tax rate, a balanced budget, and not much regulation of private business. Talmadge tended to view labor unions as conspiracies and had real little sympathy for organized labor. Talmadge's bedrock conservatism led him to oppose the NRA on philosophical grounds. He felt the federal government was giving away too much free money to those who did not deserve it. Talmadge believed, along with most Georgians, that poverty was still a sign of moral weakness. But the heart of his opposition to the NRA was based on more practical considerations. Patronage was critical to political success in Georgia, while local politicians in very small counties controlled crucial block votes. An election administration was extremely lax in some Georgia counties, overtly corrupt in others. There was no secret ballot in Georgia in the 1930s, and voters were easily intimidated. Talmadge considered it vital that all favors come from him, but he had no control over the vast sums of money being poured into Georgia under the auspices of the NRA. He was desperately afraid this power base would be eroded. Talmadge would later become an outspoken critic of the NRA and make outrageous slurs about the president's physical disability. Talmadge's meanness was legendary. But in 1934, his criticism of the president was still private. Publicly, Talmadge praised Roosevelt and castigated his enemies for trying to drive a wedge between him and the president. In an August campaign speech at Thompson, Talmadge said, "They tried to beat me by saying that I was not fair with organized labor. When all labor, organized and unorganized, knows that Gene Talmadge is the best friend they have. Now they want to beat me by saying that I'm against Roosevelt. I don't blame them for trying, because the opposition wishes mighty hard that they had a Roosevelt with his sunny smile and heartening voice to run against Talmadge, but they haven't got him. In Georgia, it's not Roosevelt against Talmadge. In Georgia, it's Roosevelt and Talmadge." The governor said that the State Federation of Labor's indictment of him was unfair and way out of line. In a signed article in his own newspaper, The Statesman, Talmadge pointed out that it was in response to a charge by the Georgia Federation of Labor that he had fired the entire five-man Public Service Commission for neglecting its duty in the reduction of utility rates. The governor said that the new commission, hand-picked by him, had taken many actions of great benefit to labor. They had reduced light and power rates, telephone rates, bus and truck rates, railroad passenger rates, and eliminated the surcharge on Pullman fares in Georgia. Talmadge suggested that the reduced light and power rates had resulted in the purchase of millions of dollars worth of new appliances and created installation and service jobs for thousands of Georgia workers. He said the reduced telephone rates had resulted in thousands of new installations and in miles and miles of additional wiring and result in additional work for the laboring man. He claimed that the reduced passenger rates and the elimination of the Pullman surcharge had forced the railroads to put on more trains, thus creating employment for the men who worked the roadbeds and otherwise assisted in moving the trains. Talmadge made much of the fact that he had never called out the troops to put down a strike. He said, "Early this year, Judge James Maddox and the sheriff of Floyd County called me to send troops to Rome, where a strike was in progress at the stove works. Instead of sending troops, I sent Mr. A. Steve Nance, president of the Atlanta Federation of Labor, and Adjutant General Lindley Camp, admonishing General Camp not to go to Rome in uniform. On the report of these two gentlemen, I did not call out the troops." In an August campaign speech at Dalton, Talmadge said, "I resent anyone on earth saying that they are closer to labor or a better friend to labor than I. I'm a laborer myself. You can look at my hands and the color of my skin and tell it." Laboring men in Bainbridge had given him his famous red suspenders. However, he maintained his opposition to the NRA wage scale of 40 cents an hour for highway construction work, saying, "It isn't right, it isn't fair, and it isn't honest for the State Highway Department or any other department of the state of Georgia to assess a minimum wage higher than the average citizen receives who pays taxes. Why isn't it fair? What is the minimum scale of wages paid to the people in Georgia who make those beautiful bedspreads and tapestries that line the highways in this section of the state? Do these white women receive 40 cents an hour for this grueling and tedious work? No. Yet, some of the opposition wants the state of Georgia to pay a boy who drives a truck or a Negro who rolls a wheelbarrow a minimum of 40 cents per hour, when a hard-working white woman in the cotton field right beside where they are is picking cotton from sunup to sundown. Organized labor was not convinced. Sid Tiller, taking note of Talmadge's claims regarding various rate reductions, responded, "We remind the governor that workers receiving wages in accord with his publicly announced policies are financially unable to take advantage of these rate reductions." Some of Talmadge's measures, ostensibly undertaken to benefit the little man, were actually of great value to the moneyed interest of the state. His dramatic ouster of the Public Service Commission to obtain a reduction in utility rates was followed by a lowering of the ad valorem tax, which more than compensated the utilities for their rate reduction. His vaunted reduction of license tag costs to $3, a major campaign plank during his first run for the governorship, profited trucking and busing companies much more than the owners of jalopies. Although Talmadge had received some labor endorsements, his relations with organized labor were quite poor on the eve of the huge general textile strike of 1934. Talmadge had been scheduled to speak in Macon Central City Park on September 3rd, the same day the strike was to begin. But the Macon Federation of Trades revoked the invitation and returned the governor $20 that he had sent him for an advertisement for his appearance. In withdrawing the invitation, the Federation cited Talmadge's recently expressed opposition to the NRA. Labor relations had deteriorated badly in Georgia's textile mills during the summer of 1934, and violence broke out weeks before the official strike ever began. A strike in Columbus had closed the Georgia Webbing and Tape Company in mid-July. When the mill attempted to reopen on August 10th, a picket line was thrown up surrounding the plant. In a scuffle between strikers on the picket line and some workers attempting to leave the factory, W.R. Sanders, a 30-year-old textile worker, was killed. Sanders was a member of Local 1605 of the United Textile Workers of America. The secretary of the local union sent a telegram to President Thomas F. McMahon of the United Textile Workers, telling them that the local union had been unable to obtain counsel in Columbus because the reputable attorneys whom we sought to engage were either connected with the manufacturers or had other excuses. The telegram first stated that the city police were trying to pin the rap on one of our boys, and we had 32 eyewitnesses to the tragedy. On Thursday, August 30th, 4 days before the strike broke out, violence occurred at the Payne Mill when pickets clashed with workers attempting to enter the gates. One woman was struck with a blackjack. The next day, minor disturbances broke out when 40 or 50 pickets, mostly women, crowded onto the railroad tracks to prevent a switch train from leaving the mill. The train was loaded with finished goods. County officers had to remove the pickets forcibly before the train could leave. Another scuffle broke out the same day in Macon at the Bibb plant when a group of strikers blocked non-sympathizers from trying to enter. The police quickly quelled that disorder. Shortly after the last scuffle, J. Ralph Gay, an organizer for the textile union, addressed the pickets and urged them to use peaceful persuasion. He told the workers they had no right to use force to prevent non-sympathizers from entering the plant. Gay warned the workers against violence and charged that mill executives might plant men to create disorders which would be blamed on the union. This charge had some basis in fact and would be repeated by union men throughout the strike. Southern mill owners, anticipating that not more than 10 or 15% of the workers would walk out, arrogantly refused to participate in a desperate final drive by the federal government to avoid the strike. The owners, consequently, were astounded when United Textile Workers strike leader Francis Gorman's brilliantly orchestrated communications network brought out 400,000 workers, 70% of those normally employed in the industry. largest strike ever directed by American labor. On September 14th, the Associated Press reported that 45,000 of Georgia's 60,000 textile workers, 75% of them, were idled by the strike. Undoubtedly, desperate economic plight and deplorable working conditions were primarily responsible for the surprisingly large walkout. But Gorman's sealed orders and creative use of flying squadrons also played a large part. The sealed orders may have been pure hokum, but flying squadrons played a real and dramatic part in the strike. On the morning the strike began, wherever a mill that had been previously unionized came out, the union men and women were in their Fords and Chevrolets in a matter of minutes and on their way to the nearest non-union town. The following press description is illustrative. Thundering into a mill town, several hundred strong, the pickets would jump out of their cars, parade before the local plant, close it down if possible, and then in a few moments disappear to appear again a few miles further on. The attitude of the manufacturers ensured that the strike would be laden with violence. The Cotton Textile Institute described the strike as an open challenge to law and order, claiming it resulted from illegal intimidation. Accordingly, the owners saw fit to take the law into their own hands. W.D. Anderson, president of the Bib Manufacturing Company and the Southern Textile Manufacturers Association, hired the notorious Red Demon, Pearl L. Burghoff, a New York-based strikebreaker. Burghoff promptly dispatched 800 thugs to Georgia, armed with clubs, tear gas, hand grenades, revolvers, and shotguns. Similar action by mill owners around the country bore fruit. 16 textile workers lay dead by the end of the strike. Only minor and sporadic violence occurred in Georgia during the first 2 days of the strike. 14 people were arrested on Tuesday, September 4th, as fistfights broke out on the picket line surrounding the local mills. 17 arrests were made at Porterdale on the same day as strikers attempted to prevent a train from entering the plant. Clubs were wielded in a fight at Cedartown, and 6 women and 2 men were arrested on charges of rioting. N.B. Murphy, the mayor of Tryon, also vice president of the Tryon Mills, telegraphed Governor Talmadge asking him to send the National Guard into the county. But the governor replied that the sheriff should be able to take care of the problem himself. Talmadge had often stated that campaign promises were sacred, and he had made a well-publicized campaign promise never to use the troops to break up a strike. With the primary election only 1 week away, he was taking no chances. Disaster struck on Wednesday, September 5th, when 2 men, a strike sympathizer, and a local deputy were killed and over a score injured in a 2-hour gun battle between workers and special deputies at the Tryon Cotton Mills in North Georgia. The mill was being guarded by 46 special deputies at the time. A local deputy blamed the whole incident on outsiders from Rome, whom he claimed attempted to disarm some of the special deputies. W.E. Hawkins, a local strike sympathizer, said that the special deputies opened fire on his men while they were getting out of their car in front of the mill. Another Georgian was killed on the same day from the Enterprise Mill in Augusta. Leon Carroll, a striker on the picket lines, was mortally wounded by 3 shots to the chest and abdomen. 2 other pickets were also seriously injured by shots from the gun of policeman Floyd Baird. Baird had charged into the picket line after allegedly being hit by a rock thrown by one of the strikers. Numerous arrests occurred throughout the day. Riotous clashes at Macon and Columbus led the Bib Manufacturing Company to close its plants all over the states. At the Bib plant in Macon, pickets flipped an automobile on its side as company officials attempted to enter the plant. Shots were fired from inside of the car, but no one was injured. Police found 2 pistols inside of the automobile. W.D. Anderson's stern visage appeared on the front page of the Atlanta newspapers the next day. along with a story describing his request to Governor Talmadge that troops be sent to Macon immediately. Mill officials in Noonan also requested troops, as did the sheriffs of Hall and Polk County. Talmadge refused. The primary election was still 5 days away. An incredible atrocity occurred at Honiopath, South Carolina on Friday, September 7th, when 6 unarmed strikers were murdered by hired guards. This brought the death toll in the South to 10. The tempo of the violence subsided during the weekend, but random clashes continued to occur throughout the state. All the mills in the Atlanta area were closed. The chief of police, T.O. Sturdivant, cited communist influence. Mill officials and local authorities in Griffin and Cartersville added their names to the list of those requesting troops to curb local disorders associated with the strike. On Wednesday, September 12th, Eugene Talmadge was reelected in a landslide, carrying 155 of the state's 159 counties. Almost immediately, Talmadge mobilized all 4,000 of Georgia's National Guardsmen and declared martial law in all sections of the state where rebellion or violence or insurrection is going on that local authorities are unable to handle. It was the largest peacetime mobilization of troops in the state's history. Troops suddenly appeared in Columbus, Porterdale, Barnesville, Griffith, Social Circle, Rome, Macon, Aragon, and Cartersville. Thousands of Georgians were arrested. Talmadge explained that martial law was in effect in all areas where National Guard companies were on duty, and military courts were provided for prisoners arrested by the Guard. Talmadge declared that military authorities on the scene could suspend civil courts and the writ of habeas corpus if necessary. Adjutant General Lindley Camp met a flying squadron of pickets near Noonan with a military flying squadron of his own, composed of 8 automobiles, each containing heavily armed guardsmen. Wholesale arrest followed, and Talmadge ordered the construction of an internment camp, soon termed a concentration camp by the press, at Fort McPherson in Atlanta to receive those arrested. Commenting on General Camp's action, Talmadge said, "Lindley Camp has captured the flying squadron and is on his way to Atlanta with it." The establishment of this concentration camp marked a precedent in the history of American labor struggles. 126 pickets, 16 of whom were women, were incarcerated behind a tall, barbed wire enclosure near the spot where Germans were interned during World War I. Georgia strike leader S.A. Holohan charged that Hitlerism had come to America. General Camp was adamant in his determination to keep the strikers interned for the duration of the strike. He declared they were officially awaiting trial by court-martial. All of the prisoners were Georgians from Hogansville, near Noonan, where they were arrested, thus rendering somewhat silly Talmadge's claim that troops were necessary to combat out-of-state agitators. Mrs. Maud Granger, a prisoner from Hogansville, was quoted as saying, "We got up at 2 o'clock this morning to go over to Noonan for picket duty. We were just peaceful picketing. We're tired and a little hungry, but we're still Union, 100%. Mrs. Granger, a woman of about 20, said they were not having a bad time at all. Explaining his actions, Governor Talmadge said, "The troops are being stationed at mills to protect lives. That means that they are there to protect both strikers and those who want to work." But this attempt at even-handedness was a charade. It became obvious that the mill owners had the governor's ear when Talmadge said, "I've already looked into this situation and found that the mills are already paying the NRA wage scale. In other words, the mills and the parties who wish to continue working in the mills are following the provisions of the National Recovery Act." It was an outrageous lie. Strike leaders insisted that there had been no trouble in the state for several days prior to Talmadge's sudden deployment of the troops, immediately after the primary election. On September 15th, after the troops had already been activated, armed thugs murdered another Union member near the mill at Aragon, Georgia. Union organizer J. Ralph Gay was arrested in Macon and held incommunicado on $75,000 bond. At the same time, strike leaders in Augusta and Columbus were arrested. Union men charged collusion between Talmadge and the mill owners. National strike leader Francis Gorman branded Talmadge an arch enemy of labor, asserting in a telegram that the governor had proven this by using armed forces of your state to drive men back into starvation conditions and absolute subservience to mill owners. Your troops have destroyed civil rights and made a mockery of your own state laws. It looked as if all was lost as starvation and intimidation took their toll and workers began drifting back into the mills in increasing numbers. The Winant Board, appointed by President Roosevelt to investigate the strike, issued a report that was equivocal at best in regard to labor's position. However, in a last-minute bit of resourcefulness, Gorman chose to call the acceptance of the Winant report an overwhelming victory and called off the strike. Notwithstanding Gorman's imaginative conclusion, the strike had been an unmitigated disaster for Georgia's textile workers. Few strikers and no union men were rehired as called for in the agreement terminating the strike. 5 Georgians were dead, and the state labor organization in the textile industry was in a shambles. The strike ended with militiamen brutally beating a 5th worker to death in front of his family when he moved too slowly when ordered from the Callaway Mill property. Talmadge was hardly liable in a criminal sense for the perpetration of any violence. By late fall of 1934, one thing was certain. He had personally broken the back of the textile unions in Georgia. In retrospect, the attempted implementation of New Deal labor policy in southern mill communities was bound to cause trouble. The cultural makeup of the mill towns and the legal reality of Section 7A of the National Recovery Act made conflict inevitable. It was the volatile personality of Eugene Talmadge that gave the textile strike in Georgia its unique drama. The militia was activated in other southern states, but Talmadge's duplicity regarding his intentions prior to the election and the brutality and flamboyance with which he suppressed the strike immediately afterward was unprecedented. His chicanery was endless. Once the strike was effectively broken, he reverted to a posture of public fairness to both sides. Talmadge publicly instructed General Camp to prevent the owners from evicting strikers from company houses. Privately, he did nothing to prevent it. He dramatically ordered a strikebreaker, Berghoff, out of the state. Georgia textile workers were not fooled. They knew where Talmadge's real loyalty lay. And in any case, the damage had already been done.